whichever one suits you.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, sir.
Whenever you need to talk, Mr. Good morning, Mr. Morgan. Thanks for coming to the Public Accounts Committee. I believe this may be your first visit, so the rules are very simple, sir. When you answer the first question, please state your full name and your title for the records. And as you would have been informed, today we're doing the ICTA 2014-15 financial statements and its relationship to off-reg, and we fully realize that these financial statements would predate off-reg, but we still have some questions in terms of the relationship between off-reg and some of the things it's doing in ICTA.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Morning, Mr. Morgan. I can assure you that the questions or coming this side won't be as the last one. What we're hoping to get from out of your session is recognizing that off-reg itself is a new entity that is fairly new, and it has brought together different sectors that were all previously regulated separately. What can, and just in the spirit of, I just want to read the section of law, not to go over it, but just in Section 6 of the law, principal functions of the office, where in particular, Section 6(1)(c)(2), ensure that utility services are satisfactory and efficient, and that charges imposed in respect of utility services are reasonable and reflect efficient costs of providing the services. It is that part of the law that we're trying to get just in terms of the feel from off-reg, in terms of what the public can expect in the sense of going forward with terms of regulations. If you were listening to the questions that we had, Mr. Famo is being ranked 190 out of 196 in terms of the cost of broadband, and then seeing what our competitors are paying elsewhere. And being only Haiti is basically beating us in the Americas between North, Central, and South America is not something that we want to brag about. And so we recognize that there's an element of where Cayman is actually subsidizing other parts of where both flow and digital operations. What we're looking for is what we can expect from off-reg in terms of especially price. Now, Mr. Famoy mentioned that that is not something, they're more focused on quality at this point. But part of what makes quality flow is affordability. So the question is then, just to kind of set the stage, just very future looking, very forward looking, and this being your first time here, we're trying to find out the culture or the remit in which you guys at off-reg is looking in terms of managing costs, not just on the ICTS side, but also on the fuel side and also on the, is that a sector? No, is it water? Yeah. From that side. Yeah. So that's what we're looking for. That's the question. Thanks.
Yes. First of all, name is J.P. Morgan. Call me J.P. if you like. And I'm the Chief Executive Officer of off-reg. As you know, off-reg is the amalgamation of the ICTA and the ERA. And what was the Petroleum Inspectorate? And we took onto ourselves the regulatory responsibilities that the Water Authority had for the water sector, for the water utilities, for the other water utilities, as well as I suppose, almost undefined creature called field markets regulation, which we can touch on if you like, through Mr. Chairman. Generally speaking, that Section 6 of the law really sets out I guess, the principal objectives against which OFREG should operate. And first is, of course, its duty for, to respond to policy direction and so on. Secondly, to promote competition. And then thirdly, in that clause that you're particularly interested in, speaks to the question of protecting consumers. And then the fourth one being to look at innovation. If you come back to that third one, you'll notice that nowhere in those sections that it talks about regulation at all, right? It's only when you get into and even when you look at the subclauses under that Section 2, that you hear it talks about then protecting consumers through regulating and so on and so on. And the assumption is, the overriding presumption is that OFREG will first of all try to drive competition, protect competition in the markets that it has responsibility for. The notion being that competition is the best driver of consumer protection. It should bring down prices, it should improve quality, and all of these sorts of issues, which economists speak about as being the ideal for consumer protection. So Section 2 is really talking about, Section 3 rather, is really talking about when there is market failure, that OFREG then needs to step in and take regulatory action. It's then saying, and Mr. Fulmer was talking earlier about significant market power and these sorts of things. It's then saying when there's market power, yes, the market failure rather, yes, the regulator needs to step in and take measures, so put measures in place to ensure that prices are, if not competitive, cost effective, that consumers get good service from these monopoly providers, and so on. I say that ideally, from our perspective, what we would want to try to do under that remit is to put in place regulations, take actions which will, as best as we can, try to mimic competition. So if we have to set up a pricing regime, for instance, in the water sector, and I use the water sector because this one is new, then we would want to try to set up a pricing formula which responds to the performance of the company, which rewards the company for its performance, which tries to penalize it if it offers poor service, not just customer service, but also quality of service in terms of the technical aspects of the service, and those sorts of issues which a provider in a competitive market would have to be concerned about if it is to survive. So to answer your question specifically, Mr. Chairman, it's that the forward-looking priorities for us is if we see that the competitive markets are not working, then we have to step in and take these regulatory actions. Now, if you'll excuse me. Now, when we look at the landscape here, the ICT market is, for the purpose of this conversation, competitive. The fuels market is, again, for the purpose of this conversation, competitive. The electricity market and the water markets are not, and they're all supplied by monopoly service providers. And therefore, the regulatory actions that we take in those markets will be a bit more intrusive. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's, excuse me, generally how we would want to try to.
Can I ask you a very direct question?
Absolutely. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Would you agree that there's been a complete market forces failure in terms of competition driving down prices in these sectors in Cayman?
Not necessarily. I believe that, and I think you're talking specifically about the ICT markets or all of them. Okay. Not necessarily. I think that there are some circumstances in the ICT market which we need to address. And again, I was hearing Mr. Farmer's testimony. The work that we're doing now in terms of doing the market analysis to determine which markets flow in this instance is dominant, I think is absolutely critical work. Because what it's really saying is that in those markets that we see that are where they're dominant, then we actually should regulate those aspects of the market and set prices. I believe.
Yeah.
I believe.
I understand Mr. Tomo's evidence and this determination of dominance.
Mm-hmm.
But I can tell you, as a member of the Legislative Assembly who was here, particularly when we did the fuel legislation, the sole purpose for all of that fuel regulation and off-reg creation was sold to the public and to the non-government benches of parliament that it was the only sure way of regulating the prices. There was nothing talked about market forces and introducing competition and all this, because I will recall quite vividly the member for East End wanting to put an amendment in the off-reg legislation specifically for fuel to use, I think, what he called the RCAM formula. And the minister at the time was very resistant and gave us the assurance that the purpose of all of this legislation was simply a roundabout way of being able to control prices, particularly on fuel.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, to fuel specifically, I believe that we can achieve what we want to achieve in terms of controlling, managing, ensuring that fuel prices are as low as possible in the model that we now have. Now, here is a challenge, I think. And quite right, I was here when that conversation took place in the House. Here's a challenge, is that the first thing that we did under the fuel markets regulation law was, as you know, was to deem the major suppliers, Sol Rubis, in the motor vehicle fuels, and also home gas, I think it is on the LPG, as having significant market power. And that's done a number of things for us. It really means that we can now put in place a set of rules to make sure that the playing field is level. We haven't as yet got to that point. We've been hampered, and again, you touched on it in the previous session, by some funding issues that we've been having in terms of being able to get that work done. But it's our only priority. It's our only priority in that sector, and it is to try to get these market rules in, by which we can then regulate.
I can't emphasize how disappointed I am to hear that after all of that fanfare and pages of legislation, you were not funded to achieve what the legislation and what the public was led to believe that you were going to do. And we are 2 years down the road?
One year and a bit. Mr. Chairman, again, I think what had happened, and I think you've heard this, what had happened was that the fuels inspectorate side of our business was funded through the appropriations that had been put in place previously for the last year for the fuels inspectorate. But in truth and in fact, the funding arrangements for the market side, that regulatory side of it, was really not put in place. We recognized this as early as May last year, and as I think you heard it yesterday, there were some cabinet decisions which have been taken, which I think will now fix that, and we can only move forward now on that basis. But yes, we ourselves are really disappointed that the funding didn't happen as rapidly as it could have.
I also recall during the debate, specifically on the creation of this whole off-reg thing, that competition was the answer. Well, we have had a new player and more competition added to the fuel, specifically for cars and trucks, but the price differential is minimal. I recall during the discussions that we were looking that competitor was going to come in at half price, be able to retail for half of what the major suppliers were doing then. And some of the reasons given were they weren't putting in all of the infrastructure and they wouldn't have that overhead. But when you drive across their station, the sign is within the same dollar range.
Yeah.
How is that possible if you have in a regulatory authority? Because what seems to happen uniquely in Cayman is that when we get competition, both on the fuel side and on the ICTA side, there is minimal competition, and then we get what I call a multi-headed monopoly, because I can't accept that it is by chance that the two major telephone companies have sales on the same day. They sell the same phone for the same price. Their charges are basically the same. When you can look on TV and in other environments where there's competition, everybody's trying to underprice everybody here. We seem to allow the providers here to settle at a comfortable profit level for both people, and the government doesn't seem to be prepared to intervene to protect the consumers by somehow getting lower prices.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. A question. Okay. Yeah.
The question is, with the addition of another provider, specifically on the truck and car fuel, how is it, without them having made the kind of investments in storage and other stuff that the other people, they are allowed to sell at the same price?
We are actually looking at the pricing structures as we speak in that particular market. Mr. Chairman, there are a number of costs I expect, and I'm seeing this now with the work not being complete, but there are a number of costs I expect which are common to the three of them, whether it's all Rubis or this new player, which are primarily the transportation and taxes and this sort of thing. And in fact, also the transportation costs to bring fuels here. So then what is correct is that the new player does have an advantage in that his local cost, his local investment and so on is less, and yes, you'd expect lower prices. I actually thought that the prices were low because I look at those prices whenever I see them, and they're usually, 20, 30, 40 cents per gallon less, which is actually...
I don't think it's ever reached 50 cents difference in gallon.
But that's, you see, the analysis that we've done is when you look at the largest providers, the spread for local costs, including, and if including profits as a cost for the moment, is about $1.50, right, which covers the wholesale and so on costs. And it is in that space which, no matter who the player is, that they will have room to operate. That's sort of what the analysis is showing us at the moment, and we're looking at it very carefully. The off-reg is new. We have to gather the data, and we're going through that data collection process as we speak. And I'm expecting that by the end of the year, we should be in a better position to, say, here are what the cost elements are as you go along, and here is what the breakout is. Truth is that I think we have to recognize that in the Cayman Islands, like any one of us in the region who are not oil producers, is that we really are price takers. And so, therefore, we are dependent on the prices at the international level. So, the price delivered to our ports, we have very little control over. The question is what happens from the ports to the retail pump, right? I will say, Mr. Chairman, that in the whole in the whole exercise of trying to do this analysis, is that all of the industry so far have been very cooperative with us, and they've been providing the data that we need, and we're not having any issues there. It's now just having a complete set of data and enough data over sufficient time to be able to do proper analysis.
True, Mr. Chairman. Well, we're still on fuel. Earlier, we heard testimony that because the telecom provider wasn't doing X, and the regulators was going to step in to do Y. The question is then, we have the same issue with the fuel. In terms of, if we look at the global fuel prices, and like I said, there is an issue between when it arrives at the port to the pump. There's a lot of stuff in between. What's then to basically stop the Cayman Islands government or the Cayman Islands people to just say, you know what, we just need to bring in one shipload of fuel. Take our money, bring in one shipload of fuel, and then basically just do what we need to do to get the market to correct itself. And I tell you exactly the challenge that we're having, and to kind of expand on what the chairman is saying. Just coming back to telecoms to make my point. If you look at page 14 of the 2016 financial statements, in particular note 7, that speaks about the amount of royalties collected, the 6% royalty. For 2016, the amount was a little over 7.5 million. At 6%, it means that your gross adjusted revenues has got to be $125 million, $125.5 million to be exact. Now, where the public is concerned, just for their own understanding, what we're basically saying is revenues minus direct costs is what it is that the companies are paying on. Now, if my memory serves me right, typically it's about 50% margin. So in order for you to get to 125 million or 125.5 million of the number that you're paying royalties on, you're talking about revenues in excess of $250 million per year, more than $250 million. And like I said, I'm only speaking on margins. It could be more, it could be less, because that's one of the things I found missing from the ICTA website. Unlike SEMA, is where SEMA aggregate the numbers of the providers. I didn't find that on the ICTA website, and that would be great, for something to have. But working with a ballpark figure of roughly 250 million plus in revenues across the providers, then it scares me to know that this kind of money is being generated, these kind of profits are being made. Because when you start getting on to about 40% EBITDA or 35 to 40% EBITDA, and you're kind of having an idea when you're working with this number that what the net profit for some of these entities are. You know what I mean? And then you're talking about not having the requisite investment that we need. This is where the problem comes in now. And what we need, what the public needs, and this is where the question is coming in now, is what is the ICT going to do? Because I can tell you, I have an idea from good sources what Ruby's profit is, what Sol profit is. I can also tell you that both of them headquarters is in Barbados, down the road from each other. And the Auditor General and the other accountants in here can tell you the one thing you can't audit against is collusion. And at this point within the market, the public doesn't have enough confidence that many of these companies aren't working together to maintain business as usual. And we have seen it because they are coming together to squeeze other guys out, other new guys out. And this is where we need the government or the buying power of the Cayman Islands people to step in, if needs be, and make the necessary adjustment to the market to make it what it is. If not, we're better off going back to having a monopoly and regulating the hell out of it.
Yes. Through you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that comment, because it is a concern that I have. And just coming out of experience, you're right. We can't regulate against collusion, but we can, in fact, create an environment where it's not easy to collude and get away with it. And this is where I feel that the introduction of companies like, for instance, this third player in the petroleum space, in the fuel space, is good. I feel that because it makes the big guys, as I like to put it, it keeps them honest, because they can in fact come in and thing. And we are seeing some concerns being expressed to the fuels group about amongst the two larger players about the impact that refuel is in fact having on the market right now. Some of the comments that are coming back are some things that they want us to do. So we are sensing that they are getting concerned. Okay, we in a lot of ways we don't have that in the ICT sector, because in truth and in fact, certainly in the mobile telephony space, it really is only Flow and Digicel. Yeah? And I recall in our jurisdiction when we had a third player operating, that all of a sudden you started to see activity on prices on products and this sort of thing. And I really do believe that despite the size of our market, despite the fact that people may say we're small but we're high value, that a third player in that space would be useful. And I think that from our point of view, we need to encourage or not discourage any possibilities of a new entrant coming in at that level. Again, to keep the marketplace, to keep the big players honest, and to offer alternatives for service. As I said, I've seen it happen in other markets and it works. It's working, in my view, in the fuels market. Excuse me, boy. Sorry about that, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Famoy spoke about the international interconnectivity, and the solutions to that, bringing a third, fourth, fifth cable, bringing more cables, international connectivity to the island, into the Cayman Islands, I think is critical at this point in time, again, to drive down broadband prices. I think we do need to see more competition there. And as he would have said, we're working actively to try to enable this to happen. So we're working on all fronts, and the idea being to try to get the market as competitive as we can.
Sorry, just clarity. we have the two lines, the CGFS, the Cayman Jamaica Fiber Service, and the Maya one.
Sorry.
Last time, and like I said, I'm just going by memory from a previous life, is that we paid, or the telecoms company paid a fixed cost to MCI and other companies, because the Maya one is owned by a consortium of companies, but one company manages it, which is Flow, locally here. But I remember our invoices to MCI, and it was a fixed cost. So the flip side about it is, and the reason why it jumped out, and I remembered, is that the cost on one cable that was owned by Cable and Wireless exclusively, even though it was copper, was at a different rate compared to what MCI was charging us at the time. So there's a fixed cost element, and when we look at, the truth of the fact is, I used a 50% gross margin in my analysis to estimate $250 million worth of revenues. The truth of the fact is the gross margin was around 70 to 80% in terms of what the actual cost was, and before you take out all the other admin expenses. That now turns the market into a $350 to $400 million market, but I assume maybe not everybody is as efficient as where it was coming from. But the flip side is, it is a fixed cost to the telecoms company in terms of what it is that they're paying, because they're actually just paying for those line rentals. And it is how much traffic now that they're putting on each side. So it's dependent on equipment you have on both sides, and now you're compressing the data, now you're sending the data and everything else. Because people be shocked to realize there's actually some really thin lines made of glass that can take up to 100 terabits. I mean, like I said, I was going back from my old days. So from that standpoint, I don't think it's an issue of just the one cable, because if you look at the Eastern Caribbean, I think they have the Eastern Caribbean fiber system over that side, and what they're paying and what we're paying, it's just greed. You know, it's not the line rental from those guys, it is greed. MCI was charging 1 cent US to terminate a call. We're charging 2 cents to call the man next door. Well, $2.40 US if you want to convert to less than 1 cent. You look at the prices that they're charging in Kingston, which is right next door, in Jamaica, right next door. Again, it is more reflective of the market. So what we're finding here is more the Cayman market being used to subsidize the other areas. We have seen it in Bahamas at Rubis, where they're popping it off in us here, but in Bahamas where they regulate the margins, they can't do the same thing. Now, Rubis went and overpaid for Texaco, that is their fault, but they're using the Cayman market to subsidize it. The question in all of this, after I've said all of that, is when are we going to put our foot down? When is the regulators going to put their foot down and say enough is enough? You guys cannot continue doing this.
One of the things, Mr. Chairman, through you, is that in order, because we quasi-judicial, we have to go through the processes to get to our decisions. And we know, I want to say since yesterday, but we now have the means to start the work, and particularly in the fuels market, to first of all understand it, one. Secondly, to look at the market structures, the pricing structures, and then 3, to put a framework in place which will do one of two things. Either, and I don't want to preempt what the outcomes might be, but for instance, but that might say, for instance, look, if you're going to move your prices by X, then you have to come back to the regulator to justify it, to make sure that we get a chance to, determine whether it's reasonable, whether in fact it's, so on and so on and so on. We need to put those rules in place so that we can make reasoned decisions in terms of how the market operates in the first place. One of the things that, for instance, could happen is that the two large ones could come together and squeeze the sticker one out. And we also need to be mindful of that and make sure that the rules ensure that they don't actually sell below cost to put this liquor one out of business. So the thing is, it's a complex set of issues that we have to look at. We're now starting the work, or we can now start the work in earnest. And our experts was talking to the guys yesterday, and our expectation is that by year end, you should be seeing a set of rules coming out, which will attempt to bring some structure to the regulatory activities in that space. Having said that, it's not that nothing has been going on, because you will recall that a couple of years ago, the dangerous substances law was amended to enable the fuels inspectorate to collect data from the sector. And it's been doing that, but unfortunately, it could only collect the data. It could do anything with it. But it was a precursor to the expectation that OFREG would be created and become effective. And so we do have at least as far as the data is concerned, we do have about a year of data, which we're trying to assemble and, to start this work. So my expectation, to your point and to your question, is that certainly around about the end of the year, we would expect to see a framework of rules coming out, which would start to bring some structure to how we manage that fuel sector. Let me just say that what the law tells us is that it recognizes that the driving point, the driver, is competition. And what the law says is that if the office determines that there is market failure, that it shall, I believe the word is shall, that's the fuel markets regulation law, it shall advise the cabinet on the remedies that it could put in place. And the reason why we've taken an advisory role here to cabinet is because, again, of this driving policy that you want to promote competition as best you can. So if we're going to get into a price setting mode, that we would need specific direction to do that. So there is that opportunity to fall back.
I remember in a previous life having sat on the immigration board, we had a provision in the law that if the board turned down a key employee.
Turned down, sir?
We had a provision in the immigration law previously that allowed companies to have key employees, designated employees, as being key. Basically, like, the company can't survive without them. And those applications had to come for the board to grant them as key, and then those people to be allowed to stay past the rollover period at the time when we had it in effect. One of the things I like about that law, especially dealing with the law firms, is that when we turned down a key, there was no appeal. And it came in quite handy because we were able to get many articleships out of it. When they came and they wanted somebody, we were like, well, you come back in 6 months, but in that in-between time, you can give articles to these 3 Caymanians for us, and we look at your application when you come back in 6 months. In other words, and they basically played nice because they really had no choice, We're dealing with multi-billion-dollar companies with deep pockets. At the same time, the government, in essence, I'm looking at this law, and I'm looking for the teeth inside the law that says when the ICT has made a decision, it's pretty much next to final. In other words, take it. And the reason why I say that is the minute you start getting into amounts in the hundreds of thousands, these guys are going to lawyer up. It's more work for you, more work for them, and the public will get nothing, and it's going to get dragged out in court for the longest while. And throughout this entire time, the consumer is basically taking it. The challenge I'm having and I'm saying it right now, especially in a consumption-based society, where literally every cent counts. And there's a culture that's being permeated now where every company and sundry feels that they can put their hands in the pockets of the consumers. We've seen it with the health insurance industry. We've seen it with the banks with $10 to cash a check or $2 even make a deposit. It's a culture that we need to change. You know what I mean? This is one sector where I believe that we can do a lot of good. But at the same time, as I said to Ali before, I recognize the players in the market are also creatures of habit. And sometimes you just need to take a stick and beat them. We can't tiptoe. And what I'm saying to you, the question in all of this is, what changes do we in this body need to make to give you the stick, not to tiptoe, but just to take one of them and beat them across the back, good and proper, give them a flogging so they can take their hands out of people's pocket. Because this is tantamount to legalized theft. And it is what we're paying for what it is that we have here. It is borderline criminal. And like I said, I haven't worked in those industries and seen the margins and seen the profits that these guys are making. And you guys see it too. You know what I mean? We need to break that culture. And the question is now, what teeth or what tools you guys need for us to flog one of these companies good and properly? $1.2 million fine ain't nothing to these guys. Nothing. Some of them make this in a week in revenues.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, through you. Boy, the only thing I can say to you is I wish, and I say that in the sense that, remember, we have to remember that we operate in a global society, in a global world. And as a regulator, any regulator, we have to be, we have to exercise all of those tenets of being a good regulator, you know, fair, transparent, and all these sorts of things. The law does give us, I think, a fairly good basis on which to do our work. Yes, we will always be subject to judicial review in any decision we take. I think it is incumbent on us to make sure that we do our work in such a way that the opportunities for JR is minimized, but they will always have that. And, you know, as you're right to say, the companies have deep pockets, and, you know, they will just file for JR just to be mischievous. They could. I say that to say that while we have to make sure that we behave prudently, judiciously, and so on, I believe that, and I say this because it's played a fairly big part in putting these laws together. I believe that perhaps we could take another look at our enforcement powers and the rate, the speed at which we get to that point where we have to enforce. I believe that the fining powers, administrative fining authority that we have is perhaps in this jurisdiction is perhaps conservative, and that's another area that we could look at. But I think fundamentally, the regulatory the regulatory framework is sufficient, except that, like I said, we were perhaps a little bit too conservative in terms of how we looked at the regulator's ability to move quickly, to enforce. They had to go through so many steps and so on. And perhaps that's an area that we could look at in some more detail, along, as I said, with the fining, the ability and the extent of the administrative fines that we could administer. Let me just say, Mr. Chairman, that the opportunity to the framework for appeal to get the judicial review by the companies has changed a little bit in this jurisdiction, in this set of laws than applied previously. And we think it's improved it, where previously what would have happened is that having taken the decision, the company could apply for a reconsideration of the matter, and then the regulator was bound to reconsider, and then if the company were still dissatisfied, they could go to the courts. What we've done in this framework is that we're bound to consult, if you like, or issue our preliminary decision first for the industry to comment and to so and so that when we put out the final decision, it has already had the benefit and the inputs of those who might be aggrieved by the decision itself. And that was an attempt to try and cut down on the length of time for the decision making. But we, as Ali would have mentioned, we've just had a circumstance where, having done that, it's just gone straight to JR, and it's perhaps something again that we might have to revisit. I don't know. But come back to your question, Mr. Chairman. I think that perhaps those are the two areas that we would probably want to look at again. Just really the whole enforcement provisions, and also the consequential fining provisions that would flow from enforcement. Just to say that on the consumer side, where the regulator takes action in terms of a dispute between a customer and the service provider, on that side, the regulator's action is not contestable. It's final. But it doesn't happen, but we don't have that same power on the industry side.
Yeah.
I don't believe it to be good practice, quite frankly, to create an environment where there is no mechanism for appeal. Natural justice provisions would go against that.
I'm not saying, that, in terms of having no appeal, what I'm not saying is it's just difficult. What the thing about it is, what I want to put out there is that we went through a period of some of the lowest oil prices around the world.
Yeah.
And we were paying the most at the pump and the plug than any other place. We're now living in the information age, where it is incumbent that our kids and everybody have access to technology. Using the global standards, and going by the article in Forbes magazine, if I was to just use that information alone, us being ranked 190 out of 196 basically tells me that 97% of the regulators are doing a better job than us. And I'm sure you will sit back and you say to me, Mr. Saunders, no, there's nowhere around the world that 97% of the regulators are doing a better job than us, while we're in the bottom 3%. But there is no reason under the sun, none, knowing what we know, and you guys seeing what you've seen, and you and I have the luxury of seeing some of these numbers that the public would not have seen, that what we're paying for, we're not getting value for money. And at some point, as the regulators, and this is what we're looking for.
Yeah.
What we're looking for is something to break the collusion and something to break these oligopolies that we have created in such a short, or duopolies, since there's only two in that section. Something to break them. But the reality of it is, and I can tell you, the pressures that we are getting from the public in terms of the cost, as people see it. You're watching TV, you see the price advertised, what you can get for a family of 4 or 5 phones inside a house, what they're paying, and unlimited minutes and all that kind of stuff. We see it. It's not as if we don't, we do. And the question is, people now want exactly the same thing. When you consider that North Korea is paying less than we are for broadband, it says something. And they're not seeing what the Americans are seeing, but we are seeing it. You know, and so what we want from the regulator is at least an awareness that price is an issue, because affordability of anything has got to be a part of quality. You know what I mean? And that the people are getting value for money. That's all we're looking for. But you can't have these guys making the money that they're making and laughing all the way to the bank.
Mr. Chairman, through you, Mr. Saunders, the only thing I can say is I agree with you. Seriously. I do agree with you. I do believe, when I look at it myself, that the price points is an issue. And I think for me the question is, do we really, if you might allow me to speak a little bit philosophically, the question that I ask myself, from where I sit, is the competition working? The work we're doing now will tell us, to a large extent, whether the competition is working or not. I think we're going to find that there are some markets in which the competition isn't working, and they may very well be the critical markets. Again, I don't want to preempt it, but this is what I suspect may come out. And then after, the question is, what do we do about those markets that are not working? And quite frankly, we have to regulate those markets. That's the convention, So I agree with you, and I believe that we have the tools to take the regulatory action, but we need to do it in such a way that it's based on solid analysis without paralyzing ourselves.
Mr. Chairman, through you. Sir, last week we had health insurance boards, we had house insurance boards. This past 3 or 4 days, I've been asked something consistently, not necessarily by the little man on the street, let's call it the middle, come up. Do these regulatory boards work for us, or do they work for those who are raping us? I remember a hurricane mashing up Florida, and Jeb Bush, getting on the radio and television the next morning and telling the people that they would not be able to raise their insurance rates any more than 5%. The elected member here from Bordentown West quoted something last week where the regulators told insurance companies, once again in Florida, that they would not be able to go any more than 9.9%. And I sit here and I listen, and the question has continuously been asked: what do you need? If the teeth are there, why are you not using them? If they are not there, why are you not advising us, the people who sit in here to make the laws, to give you the teeth, because you are not feeling it? But the people who are making $2,000 a month, the people who are making $300 a week, $400, they are feeling the crunch. People that work hard are all of a sudden asking people, help me buy food, help me pay for medication. Proud people that have worked hard their whole life. The question is very simple. If it is there, why are you not using it, the teeth, to put these and let us regulate the criminology, the highway robbery that's been going on in this country for too long, in both sectors, telecommunications and petrol? If it's not there, how soon can you advise us to give you what you need?
Mr. Chairman, it's such a good question, so that I have to really think on it. off-reg is just over a year old, and I'm not using this as an excuse, just to paint the picture for you. We have inherited in all the sectors some legislation that's been amended, yes, but some practices, some instruments, and some non-instruments where there are none, that we have had to be going through, and we're trying to modernize, if you like. There's some that we can't touch. I believe that we need the time to look at all of these instruments, because every market is different, to to just come to some fair determination as to what we have to do to either correct, amend, or so on. As you'd have heard in the previous session, we're looking, for instance, at changing the licensing frameworks which I think would make it easier. In the water sector, we have a great opportunity as we speak, and ongoing negotiations with, for instance, Cayman Water are taking a little bit longer than we planned, because we're looking at the pricing issues, and I can't say too much about it because we are in the middle of negotiations. And so those are areas where, because it's new, we can act in the way the law intended us. The new law has intended us. In the case of electricity, we're bound by a license, which I would dearly love to get my hands on, but it's a license, and therefore we have to go through the process. I feel that we're poised to change that industry with the advent of renewables and so on, and I think we have a great opportunity here with new technologies. I'm answering your question the roundabout way because I'm trying to get to the point, which is that in each of the industries there are moving parts, and we're trying to deal with each one separately and as we come along. So I go back to my earlier comment where I think at this point, if you're, as was asked of me, what do you need to do to just give yourself a little bit more oomph, if you like? I think we would need to revisit, as I said, our enforcement procedures and to our fining powers on the one hand. I think we're okay in terms of how we set the regulatory framework. We do perhaps have to revisit the regulatory arrangements in the electricity sector to give us a bit more room to deal with what is legacy issues, right? We really don't have that. So, it's a whole combination of things I think that we have to do. But basically, the overarching framework is not bad. It's good. It's reasonable. Answer your question, who are we serving? We're actually serving, and we say it every day in the office, we're actually serving the consumers. And with each decision that we take, each time something comes before us, the first question we ask ourselves, how is this going to impact on consumers? So it's not that we are unaware, but we do have some legacy issues that we have to overcome. And this we have to do in a consistent, sensible way so as not to disturb the way we're viewed, because we are in the global marketplace.
Mr. Chairman, I was outside when this gentleman sworn in and came in and so forth. But I would bet that you reminded him of the fanfare and the hoopla that was made last when this was coming in here. And to see.
But it hasn't changed, because the problem we have is being manifested in the government's absolute rejection of any kind of pricing formulas being introduced, RCAM or otherwise, because we're relying on competition to regulate prices, and we're spending our time trying to calculate whether there's market failure or not market failure, and whether we're getting this or we're not getting that. Because in the case of electricity with CUC, where we have a monopoly, irrespective of what we may think of some nuances in the license, the fact that we regulate the prices is a direct benefit to the consumer. What we're getting in all of the other subjects, and we also have that in the Water Authority. I think the Water Authority also uses RCAM in pricing, or there was an announcement made in this Legislative Assembly that they were going to try and get the private water company to agree to RCAM, because they recognize the benefits in having a systematic way of price control. But I get the distinct impression from all the evidence given today that that is not the route that the regulatory authorities on the other sectors would like to go. The regulatory authorities are convinced that the government policy of non-pricing formulas as part of the regulating mechanism is the right choice, and that some way down the road in the future, competition will magically take care of it. Because I would hazard the guess that the listening public are not of the view that the government's position of not wanting to introduce pricing formulas is helping the consumers in either the ICTA market or the fuel regulation market.
Sorry, before you comment, just to expand on what the chairperson was saying, looking at CUC's numbers, and I'm about to say something that's not politically, I don't use the word like sexy or whatever, but from all the entities I've looked at, CUC seems to be the best regulated one in all of them. And if I was to be fair to CUC, taking out the fuel factor and looking at their margins, it's fairly within industrial standard. You look at their return on your base rate. I mean, in terms of what is calculated and everything else, I know it is done, that is fine. And if there's one thing that we have seen on the CUC, because I looked at their numbers from 2011 to 2016, 2017, and you can see in terms of the actual cost in generating fuel per kilowatt hour has dropped like over 50% in a 4-year period. Granted, part of that came from fuel coming down too. But at least the way the model was set up, it at least incentivized CUC to go out and invest in plants that were much more fuel efficient, and also to some extent renewables also, to better their margin, because at the end of the day, it's still a flow through. The big issue on the CUC bill, if you really, I remember at one point looking at my CUC bill, 50% of it, 55% was fuel factor, 35% was actually CUC costs, and 10% was basically the government fees that they have stick in. And I mean, to some extent, CUC was being blamed unfairly because the only job that they had was really producing a ransom note for take people where the fuel is concerned. So the fuel still remains the biggest issue. I mean, looking at even the 2011, just to kind of give people an idea, electricity sales, 70 million, fuel factor, 148 million, I mean, which is like more than what it is. Now, last year, just to kind of give people an idea, in 2017, electricity sale, 82 million, and fuel factor, 89 million. So now you have seen a drop between 70 million of electricity sale versus 148 in fuel factor, compared now to 82 million in electricity sale and 89 million in fuel factor. So you can see the ratio of change, some of it being through lower fuel costs and some of it being through better efficiency in terms of that. So I say all of that to say this. Living in the information age, and whether we want to accept it or not, especially on the telecom side, we are wholly inadequate in some of the services that we're receiving. I mean, we have seen it with some of the guys, they come here in terms of roaming, which is a whole different thing altogether, in terms of what it is that they're offering, in terms of next generation and everything else. Wouldn't it be better for some of these guys, rather than just to be sitting down, making a mint off of their equipment that's already been paid for, old equipment that has already paid for many times over? Wouldn't it be better then to start looking at some of these guys who are more established and start looking on a return on their base, as opposed to what it is, leaving it as it is, and we're getting what we're getting?
If I understand you right, you're suggesting that some of the more the established companies, like the cable and wireless, for instance, that we should perhaps be looking at a rate of return kind of regulatory price setting mechanism for them. I think not. And the reason I think not is because, particularly in that industry, which is technologically driven, and they have to be constantly, and I hope they are constantly making investments to keep pace with the yes, and I have to rely on the ICT experts to tell me this. But my point is this: is that in that industry, you can't anymore talk traditionally about 25-year depreciation and so on, because the technology changes just so rapidly, and the need for new investments and thing is such that you have to depreciate much faster. So it's a different business model, if you like, a different pricing model, which I do believe that we have to leave the companies in a position to respond to technology changes and to invest as they go along. No. The question is whether the flow through to prices are reflect all of these gains that they should be making through the investments in technology is something which I agree with you. We have to be concerned about. And I agree with you that we will take on board, look at in-house to see, but I would disagree with you that we should attempt to interfere in those aspects of the market that is competitive. There are aspects, I admit, of the market that are not competitive and that we have to regulate. So,
to put something in, to put my idea in context, let's use the Maya one.
Yeah.
It's been there forever and a day. Now, part of what is driving a new subsea cable to the Cayman Islands is simple. That one, I think by the rules, it is limited for them to charge rental when you only have X amount of useful life left on a subsea cable.
Yeah.
So in other words, these guys would run it all the way into the ground before something new is done. But yet, at the same time, we must believe, because at the end of the day, this handset means nothing if for me to connect into the United States, I'm still running it over a very old network, which is the Maya one in this case, that they're talking about when it was laid and what it was laid for. Okay? So, based on that, and we are now 15 years liberalized, March gone, make 15 years liberalized. You mean to tell me in 15 years, we could not have one other subsea cable to the Cayman Islands, where that is the one thing that we need to connect ourselves to the world. But no, Digicel or Dennis O'Brien is getting up, he's starting a new company to do it because cable and wireless one is getting old and no use. Another company is looking at one. So it basically took for them to run the Maya one straight out of its old ways before something new. So if for 15 years they have sat back, and it's going to probably be at least another year or two, maybe 20 years, before we probably get another subsea cable inside here, then the reality of it is, for we to trust them with innovation when they can't even connect us to the rest of the world in a more technological way. But then, at the end of the day, yeah, but at the end of the day, the main thing for us in all of this is that they're not investing because we don't see anything new other than ansets. At the end of the day, the connection is still the same old connection to the rest of the world. You know what I mean? So if that is what we have to rely on, then clearly it's not working now. If these guys sat down and, as you said, depreciate their asset much quicker over a 5-year period, and then we set in a certain return on their investment, as we do with CUC and elsewhere, it would force them at least every 5 years to go and do something new, because if not, the number is going to drop. But you can't expect people to be sitting down paying for the same thing over and over and over when these guys have already made a mint off of it. Cayman wireless landlines have already been paid for a long time, and yet they're still raising fees on it, and they're still getting permission to increase the fees, to quote unquote, to pay for super fast broadband being rolled out across the island, but I can't get it in the Eastern District because it is considered rural. Or it can't go different places. So the whole thing behind it, and this is what I want to say to you in terms of the question. The same thinking that got us here can't be the same thinking that's going to move us away from here. And that is coming back to my point. We just need to flog one. Just find one of them, flog them good. Send a message. But the culture is where everybody feels no. You see, we have allowed the telecoms to do it, now the banks start to do it. Who's next? The supermarkets are already doing it. Who's next? Everybody and the auntie is putting their hands inside the people's pocket. So many people can't even afford the pockets. So this is what we need. Just flog one. If we're going to tie them up in court, so be it. If we're going to slow down the business, so be it. But worst case, the reality of it is, if we continue at this rate, we're better off going back to monopoly power and then regulating them like we do in CUC. At least we get something better.
If not, sir, Mr. Morgan. Thank you very much, sir. It was an interesting conversation. I don't believe the consumers are going to be any better off, but that's just my view. But thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. Thank you.
We'll come back for lunch at 2 o'clock. I know we have a 1:30 schedule, but I've asked the clerk to contact him, tell him to come at 2. Thank you very much, sir.